The cup shattered on the floor the moment Lyra Ashworth felt her bones begin to shift beneath her skin. She grabbed the edge of the kitchen table, knuckles white, breath coming in short, panicked pulls. Not now, not here. Not with Grace standing 3 feet away, chatting about nothing, completely unaware that the woman in front of her was seconds from losing 5 years of careful, exhausting control. "Lyra, you look pale." Grace tilted her head, curiosity flickering behind friendly eyes. "Are you feeling sick?" "I'm fine," Lyra managed, forcing her voice to stay even, while her pulse hammered so loud she was sure Grace could hear it. "Just tired. Long night." It was a lie, one of hundreds she had told over the years. The truth was far more dangerous than tiredness. The truth was clawing up from somewhere deep inside her chest, pushing against her ribs, begging to be let out. She could feel her canine teeth lengthening slightly against her tongue, feel the telltale heat spreading down her spine. She pressed her palm flat against her sternum, willing her heartbeat to slow, praying the sensation would pass the way it always eventually did. It was the herbs. She was almost certain of it. The suppressant tea she drank every morning, brewed from a recipe her mother had once shared in hushed tones, had been weaker this week. She'd run low on wolfsbane root and used a smaller portion than usual, hoping it would be enough to get her through another few days before she could gather more. She had been wrong. Grace was still watching her, brow furrowed now instead of curious. Lyra forced a smile, straightened her spine, and stepped back from the table, putting a careful few feet of distance between them. "I think I just need some air," she said. "I'll walk it off." She didn't wait for Grace to respond. She turned and walked out of the small kitchen, out through the narrow hallway of the pack house, and into the cool evening air outside, moving with the practiced calm of someone who had spent 5 years learning exactly how to disappear in plain sight. The moment the door closed behind her, she broke into a near run, cutting across the yard toward the tree line at the edge of the territory. Her skin felt too tight, her senses too sharp. She could smell everything: the damp moss on the stones, the distant smoke from someone's fire, the sweetness of decaying leaves, and beneath it all, her own scent, changing, shifting, becoming something other than human. She reached the trees just as the first tremor rolled through her shoulders. Lyra dropped to her knees behind a wide, gnarled oak, gritting her teeth, forcing her breathing into the rhythm her mother had taught her long ago. In, hold, out. In, hold, out. It was a technique meant to calm the wolf, to convince the animal within that there was no danger, no reason to break free. It had worked for years. It had to work now. She thought of her mother's voice, soft but urgent. From a memory so old it had gone soft at the edges like a worn photograph. "Never let them see you, Lyra. Not even a flash of white fur. Promise me." She had promised. She had kept that promise through childhood, through the awkward, aching years of adolescence when her wolf had wanted nothing more than to run free under the moon with the other pups her age, through every full moon gathering she had faked illness to avoid, through every near miss and every whispered rumor that had almost given her away. Tonight, crouched in the dirt with her claws beginning to push through her fingertips, she was terrified the promise was about to break. "Please," she whispered to no one, to the trees, to whatever force controlled the moon and the blood in her veins. "Not tonight, not like this." Slowly, agonizingly, the tremors began to ease. Her claws retracted. The heat in her spine cooled to something bearable. She stayed on her knees for a long moment, forehead resting against the rough bark of the oak, waiting until she was certain the danger had passed, before she trusted herself to stand. When she finally rose, her legs were shaking, but she was still herself, still human, still hidden. She would need more wolfsbane root by morning. There was no more room for error. It was as she made her way back toward the pack house, brushing dirt from her knees and trying to steady her breathing into something that would pass for normal, that she noticed the commotion. Torches burned bright along the main path leading into the territory, more than she had ever seen lit at once. Pack members were gathering in tight, murmuring clusters, their voices carrying fragments of conversation on the evening breeze. Words like arrival and inspection and the king floated toward her, and Lyra felt a fresh spike of dread settle low in her stomach, colder and heavier than the fear she had just fought off in the trees. She caught sight of Owen near the edge of the crowd, one of the few people in the pack she trusted enough to call a friend. though even with him she had never let her guard down completely. He waved her over, his expression a mixture of excitement and nerves that seemed to be shared by everyone around them. "Where have you been?" he asked, keeping his voice low as she reached his side. "You're missing everything." "Missing what?" "The Alpha King." Owen said the words like they tasted strange in his mouth, as though he still couldn't quite believe them. "Kael Draven. He's coming here. Tonight." Lyra's stomach dropped. The Alpha King ruled over every pack in the region, a position of power so absolute that most wolves went their entire lives without ever standing in his presence. He was a figure spoken of in low, respectful tones, a name invoked to settle disputes and enforce law across territories that would otherwise have torn each other apart. His visits were rare. His attention was rarer still. And attention, Lyra knew with a certainty that made her chest ache, was the very last thing she could afford. "Why?" she asked, proud of how steady her voice sounded despite the roaring in her ears. "Why would the Alpha King come here, of all places?" Owen shrugged, though his eyes were bright with the kind of nervous thrill that came from being close to something enormous and unknowable. "Nobody really knows. Some people are saying there have been disturbances near the northern border. Others are saying he's investigating rumors." "Rumors of what?" "That's the part nobody agrees on." Owen leaned in slightly, lowering his voice further, as though the words themselves were dangerous to say aloud. "Some people are saying there's talk of a hidden bloodline, a wolf that shouldn't exist anymore." Lyra's blood turned to ice in her veins. She kept her face carefully blank, the same mask of mild curiosity she had perfected over years of practice, even as every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to hide, to disappear into the trees and never come back. She had heard those same rumors before, whispered in different forms across different territories over the years, each time sending her into weeks of careful, paranoid vigilance before the danger seemed to pass. She had told herself, over and over, that the world had moved on, that the old fears about her mother's bloodline had faded into myth and superstition. She had told herself she was safe. She had been wrong before. She might be wrong now. "That's just an old story," she said, forcing a small, dismissive laugh that felt brittle even to her own ears. "Nobody's seen a wolf like that in decades. If they ever existed at all." Owen shrugged again, clearly more interested in the spectacle of a royal visit than in old legends. "Maybe. But you should have seen Elena's face when she got the message. She looked like she'd seen a ghost." Elena. The pack elder who had taken Lyra in after her mother's death, the woman who had raised her in careful secrecy for the better part of 2 decades, who knew exactly what Lyra was, and exactly what it would mean if the wrong eyes ever saw the truth. If Elena was frightened, then Lyra had every reason to be terrified. "I need to find her," Lyra said, already turning away from the gathering crowd. "Excuse me, Owen." She didn't wait for his response. She moved through the throng of pack members, with careful, measured steps, resisting the urge to run, even as every nerve in her body urged her toward panic. She found Elena near the front steps of the pack house, standing very still, watching the road that led into the territory with an expression Lyra had rarely seen on the older woman's face. Fear. "Elena." The older woman turned at the sound of her name, and for just a moment, before she composed herself, Lyra saw something raw and unguarded in her eyes. Then it was gone, tucked away behind the same careful composure Elena had taught Lyra to wear like armor. "You heard," Elena said. It wasn't a question. "The Alpha King is coming." Lyra kept her voice low, barely above a whisper, even though the noise of the gathering crowd would have swallowed the words regardless. "Owen said there are rumors about a bloodline." Elena's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "There are always rumors, Lyra. That doesn't mean anything." "Then why do you look like that?" The question hung between them, sharp and unanswered, until Elena finally exhaled and reached out to grip Lyra's arm, her fingers surprisingly strong for a woman of her age. "Listen to me carefully. Whatever happens tonight, whatever happens over the coming days, you keep your head down. You stay quiet. You do not draw attention to yourself, not for any reason. Do you understand?" "I always do." "I know." Elena's grip tightened slightly. "But this is different. The Alpha King is not like the pack leaders you've learned to avoid. He is old, and he is powerful, and he has spent his entire reign hunting down exactly the kind of secret you're carrying. If he suspects anything, even for a moment, there will be nowhere for you to hide. Lyra swallowed against the tightness in her throat. Do you think he knows? About me? I think, Elena said carefully, choosing each word as though it might shatter if handled wrong, that we cannot afford to assume anything. We prepare for the worst, and we hope for the best. That is all we have ever been able to do. Behind them, a ripple of sound moved through the crowd, voices rising in a wave of anticipation and fear. Lyra turned toward the source, and felt her stomach drop for the second time that evening. At the far end of the main road, moving with the kind of unhurried confidence that spoke of absolute authority, a procession was approaching. Torchlight caught on dark clothing, on the glint of what might have been jewelry or weapons, on the broad shoulders of a figure who walked slightly ahead of the others, radiating a kind of presence that made every wolf in the crowd instinctively lower their gaze. The Alpha King had arrived. Lyra felt Elena's hand tighten once more on her arm, a silent, final warning, before the older woman released her and stepped forward to join the other pack elders assembling to greet their visitor. Lyra remained where she was, half hidden in the crowd, her heart pounding so hard she was certain the sound alone might give her away. She told herself to look away, to keep her eyes down the way every instinct and every year of careful training demanded, but something in her refused to obey. Some reckless, curious part of her lifted her gaze anyway, just as the Alpha King drew close enough for torchlight to fully illuminate his face. He was younger than she had expected, though age meant little among wolves who could live centuries beyond human years. His features were sharp and severe, carved from the kind of confidence that came from never once having to question his own authority. His eyes swept across the assembled crowd, with slow, deliberate attention, cataloging faces, weighing threats, missing nothing. And then, for one impossible, heart-stopping moment, those eyes met hers. Lyra froze. It lasted only a second, perhaps less, before his attention moved on to the elders stepping forward to greet him. But in that brief moment, she had seen something flicker across his expression, something sharp and searching, as though he had caught the scent of something unexpected on the evening air and was trying to place it. She lowered her gaze immediately, cursing herself for having looked at all, for having given him even a single second to notice her. She melted back into the crowd, putting bodies between herself and the road, forcing her breathing back into a steady, controlled rhythm, even as her mind raced with panic. He had looked at her. Out of an entire crowd of pack members, in the middle of a formal royal greeting, his eyes had found hers, and lingered, just for a moment, just long enough to feel deliberate rather than accidental. It could mean nothing. It could mean everything. Lyra pressed her back against the rough wood of the pack house wall, closed her eyes, and tried to remember how to breathe normally, all while a single, terrifying thought echoed through her mind on an endless loop. He knows something is different. And she had 5 years of careful hiding, and no idea at all how much longer she would be able to keep it that way. The crowd's murmuring rose and fell around her like water, but Lyra barely heard any of it. She kept her eyes fixed on the ground, watching the Alpha King's boots as he moved through the formal greetings, exchanging words with pack elders whose voices she couldn't focus enough to understand. Every part of her wanted to flee, to disappear into the trees, and keep running until the territory was nothing but a memory behind her. But running would only confirm whatever suspicion might already be forming in his mind. Running was exactly what a guilty creature would do. So she stayed. She stood among the others, shoulders squared, expression carefully neutral, and endured the longest, most agonizing hour of her life, as the Alpha King was formally welcomed into the territory that had, until tonight, felt like the safest place in the world. By the time the crowd finally began to disperse, torches burning low and voices growing quiet with exhaustion, Lyra's nerves were stretched thin as wire. She slipped away from the gathering as soon as she reasonably could, moving quickly toward the small cottage at the edge of the territory that she called home, desperate for the privacy of 4 walls and a locked door. She didn't make it far before a voice stopped her. "You're the one who was staring at the crowd near the elders' platform." Lyra turned, heart lurching, to find a young man she didn't recognize watching her with narrowed, calculating eyes. He wore the dark, formal clothing of the Alpha King's personal guard, and his expression carried none of the casual friendliness she was used to from her own pack members. "I don't know what you mean," she said carefully. "The king noticed you." The guard's gaze swept over her, assessing, suspicious. He doesn't usually notice anyone in a crowd that size. What's your name? Every instinct in Lyra's body screamed at her to lie, to give a false name and disappear before this stranger could connect her to anything. But lying to a member of the Alpha King's guard, on the very first night of his visit, felt like a risk far greater than telling the truth. Lyra, she said. Lyra Ashworth. The guard studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment, as though weighing the name against some internal list of concerns. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Lyra standing alone in the darkening evening, with her heart hammering against her ribs, and a single, chilling certainty settling over her. Her name had just been noticed by the Alpha King's own guard. 5 years of careful hiding, and it had taken less than a single evening for her secret to feel more exposed than it ever had before. Sleep did not come easily that night. Lyra lay on her narrow bed with her eyes fixed on the ceiling, replaying the moment the Alpha King's gaze had found hers, replaying the guard's suspicious questions, replaying every possible mistake she might have made without realizing it. Had her scent changed too much during her near shift in the forest? Had someone seen her running toward the trees earlier that evening and mentioned it to the wrong person? There were too many variables, too many ways the careful life she had built could unravel, and no way to know which thread, if any, had already begun to pull loose. She thought of her mother, as she often did in moments of fear, and let the memory carry her back to a night nearly 2 decades old, one that had shaped every decision she had made since. Lyra had been 6 years old the night her mother woke her in the dark, pressing a hand over her mouth before she could make a sound, whispering a single word. Run. She remembered very little of what followed with any real clarity. Fragments only. The cold bite of night air against her skin, her mother's hand gripping hers so tightly it hurt, the sound of distant howling, angry and purposeful, growing closer no matter how fast they moved. Her mother's white fur, glowing faintly under the moon, more beautiful and more terrifying than anything Lyra had ever seen, as her mother finally turned to face the wolves pursuing them, and told her daughter to keep running, and never look back. Lyra had not obeyed. She had hidden behind a fallen tree, too frightened to run any farther, and watched from a distance, as her mother fought against wolves twice her size, her white coat catching moonlight, like something sacred, even as dark blood began to stain the pale fur. She remembered the sound her mother made when she finally fell, a sound that still echoed in Lyra's nightmares even now, and the way the attacking wolves had circled the fallen body afterward, sniffing and snarling, before finally retreating into the darkness, satisfied that the threat had been ended. Lyra had stayed hidden until dawn, shaking, silent, alone in a way she had never been alone before. It was Elena who found her hours later, drawn by rumors of trouble near the border, and who had made the decision, on the spot, to take the frightened orphan child in, rather than leave her to whatever fate awaited a wolf without a pack. "You must never tell anyone what you are," Elena had said to her that first night, kneeling in front of 6-year-old Lyra, with an intensity that had frightened her almost as much as the memory of her mother's death. "Do you understand me? Not your name, not your bloodline, nothing that could connect you to what happened. If they knew what you were, what your mother was, they would come for you too." Lyra had understood, in the vague, instinctive way that children understand danger, even without fully grasping its shape. She had learned quickly, faster than perhaps any child should have to, how to make herself small and quiet and unremarkable, how to blend into the background of pack life so thoroughly that most people forgot she was there at all. She learned the recipe for the suppressant tea from Elena, learned to recognize the earliest tremors of an unwanted shift and how to fight them back down, learned to smile and nod and deflect any question that came too close to the truth. By the time she reached adolescence, hiding had become as natural to her as breathing. She watched other pups her age run wild and free during full moon gatherings, tumbling over each other in play, howling at the sky with a joy she was never permitted to share, and she told herself, again and again, that the safety of staying hidden was worth more than the freedom she was giving up. Most nights, she believed it. Tonight, lying awake with the memory of the Alpha King's sharp, searching gaze still burned into her mind, she wasn't so sure. She must have drifted off eventually, because she woke to pale gray morning light filtering through her window, and the distant sound of pack members, already moving about their daily routines outside. For one brief, blissful moment, she forgot everything that had happened the night before. Then memory crashed back over her, and she sat up quickly, already running through the mental checklist she had developed over years of managing her secret. Suppressant T. She needed more wolfsbane root before her next dose ran too low again. She needed to move carefully today, to avoid drawing any further attention, to somehow discover exactly why the Alpha King had come to their territory, without revealing her own desperate interest in the answer. She dressed quickly, and made her way to the small kitchen at the back of the cottage, where her modest supply of dried herbs sat in careful rows along a wooden shelf. Her stomach sank the moment she saw the nearly empty jar of wolfsbane root, confirming what she had already feared the night before. She would need to gather more from the forest today, which meant venturing farther from the safety of the pack house than she usually preferred, especially with the Alpha King's guards now patrolling unfamiliar territory. There was no other option. She packed a small satchel with the tools she would need, and set out toward the eastern edge of the territory, where the wolfsbane grew wild among the rocky outcroppings that most pack members avoided due to the difficult terrain. The morning air was crisp and cool, and for a while, moving through the quiet forest with a task to focus on, Lyra allowed herself to feel something close to calm. The trees here were old and tall, their canopy thick enough to filter the sunlight into soft, shifting patterns on the forest floor. She had always found peace in these woods, a peace she rarely felt anywhere else, as though the trees themselves understood and accepted the parts of her she had to hide from everyone else. She was crouched beside a cluster of wolfsbane, carefully working the roots free from the rocky soil, when the crack of a twig behind her sent her heart into her throat. She spun around, instinctively positioning herself between the exposed roots and whoever had approached, only to find herself face to face with the last person she expected to encounter, alone in the forest. The Alpha King stood a short distance away, dressed more casually than he had been the previous evening, though nothing about his bearing suggested anything other than absolute authority. His sharp eyes moved from her face to the herbs scattered on the ground beside her, and something like curiosity flickered across his features. "Wolfsbane root," he observed, his voice low and even, carrying the kind of weight that came from a lifetime of never having to raise it to be heard. An unusual thing to be gathering this far from the pack house. Lyra's mind raced, searching for an explanation that would satisfy his obvious curiosity without revealing anything dangerous. "It has medicinal uses," she said carefully. "For headaches, and for calming the nerves. Does it work?" The question was simple, almost conversational, but there was something beneath it, some sharper intent she couldn't quite identify. "Sometimes," she said. "It depends on the person." He studied her for a long moment, and Lyra fought the urge to look away, knowing instinctively that showing weakness or evasion now would only deepen whatever suspicion might already be forming in his mind. Instead, she held his gaze, forcing herself to appear calm despite the frantic hammering of her heart. "You were at the gathering last night," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "I was. I noticed you." His tone remained even, almost casual, but Lyra felt the words land like a blow all the same. "You have an unusual presence for someone standing at the back of a crowd." "I'm not sure what you mean." "No," he said, something almost like amusement flickering at the corner of his mouth. "I don't suppose you do." He took a step closer, and Lyra had to consciously stop herself from stepping back, aware that retreating now would only confirm whatever he suspected. Up close, his presence was even more overwhelming than it had been from a distance the night before, a kind of gravity that seemed to pull the air itself toward him. "What's your name?" he asked, though something in his expression suggested he might already know the answer. "Lyra." She kept her voice steady with effort. "Lyra Ashworth." He nodded slowly, as though confirming something he'd already been told. "Tell me, Lyra Ashworth, how long have you lived in this territory?" "My whole life. Since I was very young." "And your parents?" The question hit her like a physical blow, though she kept her expression carefully neutral, drawing on years of practice to keep the sudden spike of grief and fear from showing on her face. "I don't have any. I was raised by Elena, one of the pack elders." Something shifted in his expression, subtle but unmistakable, a kind of sharpening focus that made Lyra's stomach twist with dread. "An orphan," he said, almost to himself. "How did your parents die, if you don't mind my asking?" I was too young to remember the details, she lied, the words coming smoothly despite the way her heart pounded against her ribs. Elena has always said it was an accident. He was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through the careful mask she had spent years perfecting. Lyra held perfectly still, resisting every instinct that urged her to flee, to explain, to do anything other than stand quietly and wait for whatever judgment he was silently forming. You should be more careful gathering herbs alone this far from the pack house, he said finally, his tone shifting into something almost gentle, though the sharp assessment never fully left his eyes. These woods aren't entirely safe for anyone. It was, Lyra realized with a jolt of surprise, a dismissal rather than an accusation. Whatever he had been searching for in her face, in her answers, he had apparently decided to let the matter rest, at least for now. Thank you for the concern, she said carefully. I know these woods well, I'll be careful. He held her gaze for one more long moment, and Lyra had the distinct, uncomfortable sensation that he was memorizing her face, filing away every detail for future reference. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back through the trees, in the direction he had come, his broad shoulders disappearing into the dappled morning light, as though he had never been there at all. Lyra remained crouched beside the wolfsbane for a long time after he'd gone, waiting for her racing heart to slow, waiting for the trembling in her hands to steady enough to finish her work. When she finally trusted herself to move, she gathered the roots as quickly as she could and hurried back toward the pack house, her mind spinning with everything that had just happened. He had sought her out. Whatever excuse he might have given for wandering the eastern woods that morning, Lyra didn't believe for a moment that his presence there had been an accident. He had noticed her the night before, and rather than letting the matter go, he had followed up, testing her with careful questions designed to probe for weaknesses in her story. She had passed the test, she thought, or at least she hadn't obviously failed it, but something told her this wouldn't be the last time the Alpha King sought her out, and she wasn't at all certain she would be able to maintain her careful deception indefinitely. By the time she reached the cottage, Elena was waiting for her on the front step, arms crossed, expression tight with barely contained worry. "Where have you been?" the older woman demanded, before Lyra had even fully crossed the yard. "I've been looking for you for an hour." "Gathering wolfsbane root," Lyra said, holding up the satchel as proof. "I was almost out." Elena's eyes narrowed, taking in Lyra's flushed cheeks, and the barely perceptible tremor still lingering in her hands. "What happened? Tell me everything." Lyra hesitated only a moment before relaying the encounter, watching as Elena's expression grew increasingly grim with each detail. When she finished, the older woman was silent for a long moment, her jaw tight, her eyes fixed on some middle distance, as though calculating 100 different possibilities at once. "He sought you out deliberately," Elena said finally. "That is not a good sign. I don't think I gave anything away." "Perhaps not." Elena's expression remained troubled. "But the Alpha King did not become the most powerful wolf in this region by accident, Lyra. If he suspects something, he will not simply let the matter drop because you answered his questions convincingly once. He will watch, he will wait, and he will find another opportunity to test you, when you least expect it." The words settled over Lyra like a physical weight, confirming the fear that had been building in her chest since the moment she'd first felt his eyes on her the night before. "What do I do?" Elena's gaze softened slightly, though the worry never fully left her expression. "You do exactly what you have always done. You stay careful, you stay quiet, and you pray that whatever brought him to our territory has nothing to do with you at all." But even as Elena spoke the words, Lyra could see in her eyes that neither of them truly believed they would be so fortunate. 3 days passed, and Lyra began to believe, cautiously, that perhaps the worst had passed. The Alpha King's guards had settled into a routine, patrolling the borders of the territory and meeting with pack elders in long, closed-door sessions that no one below a certain rank was permitted to attend. Lyra kept herself busy with ordinary tasks, mending clothes, helping in the communal gardens, anything that kept her hands occupied and her mind too tired at the end of the day to spiral into anxious thoughts. She increased her dose of suppressant tea slightly, unwilling to risk another near shift like the one that had nearly exposed her the night the king arrived, and for 3 days, her careful precautions seemed to be working. On the fourth day, everything changed. It began with a summons, delivered by the same sharp-eyed guard who had questioned her outside the pack house that first night. He found her in the garden, kneeling in the dirt with soil beneath her fingernails, and informed her without preamble that the Alpha King required her presence immediately. Me? Lyra straightened slowly, brushing dirt from her hands, trying to keep the sudden spike of alarm from showing on her face. Why would the Alpha King want to speak with me? The guard's expression remained carefully blank. I wasn't told the reason. Only that you're to come with me now. There was nothing to do but comply. Refusing a direct summons from the Alpha King would draw far more attention than simply obeying, and Lyra had spent enough years learning to avoid attention that the choice, however frightening, was hardly a choice at all. She followed the guard through the pack house grounds toward the largest building on the property, a converted meeting hall that had been given over entirely to the king and his retinue for the duration of his visit. Her mind raced the entire walk, cycling through every possible explanation, every story she might need to tell, every lie she might need to maintain under pressure. Had someone reported the encounter in the woods? Had her scent given something away that she hadn't noticed? Had Elena's careful warnings not been enough to protect her after all? The guard led her into a small side room off the main hall, sparsely furnished with little more than a wooden table and a few chairs, and informed her that the king would join her shortly before withdrawing and closing the door behind him. Lyra stood in the center of the room, resisting the urge to pace, forcing herself to breathe slowly and evenly, despite the anxiety coiling tight in her chest. The door opened again several minutes later, and the Alpha King entered alone, closing it firmly behind him. Without the crowd of the greeting ceremony, without his retinue of guards and advisors, the sheer weight of his presence felt even more overwhelming than it had before. He studied her for a moment, before gesturing toward one of the chairs at the table. "Sit," he said. "This isn't an interrogation, Lyra. I simply have questions." The distinction did little to ease her nerves, but she lowered herself into the offered chair regardless, keeping her hands folded carefully in her lap to hide their slight tremor. He took the seat across from her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough that his scent, something like cedar and rain and something darker beneath, filled the small space between them. "You've lived in this territory your entire life," he said, watching her closely. "And yet, when I ask around, very few people seem to know much about you at all. You keep to yourself. You avoid the full moon gatherings whenever possible. You have no mate, no close pack ties beyond the woman who raised you. Does that seem unusual to you?" Lyra kept her expression carefully neutral, drawing on years of practice. "I've never been particularly social. Some wolves prefer solitude. I don't think that's unusual." "Perhaps not, on its own." He leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her feel as though every careful lie she'd ever told might be visible on her skin. "But I've been Alpha King for a long time, Lyra Ashworth. I've learned to recognize patterns. A wolf who avoids the full moon gatherings, who keeps her distance from close bonds, who disappears into the woods alone at unusual hours to gather herbs with calming properties. These are not the habits of an ordinary wolf who simply prefers solitude. These are the habits of someone hiding something." Her heart pounded so hard she was certain he could hear it, could smell the sudden spike of fear rolling off her skin, despite every effort to control her reaction. "I don't know what you think I'm hiding," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I've done nothing wrong." "I didn't say you'd done anything wrong." His tone remained even, almost gentle, though his eyes never lost their sharp, assessing quality. "I said you're hiding something. Those are not the same accusation." Lyra said nothing, unsure how to respond without either confirming his suspicions or offering a denial so forceful it would seem equally suspicious. The silence stretched between them, taut and uncomfortable, until he finally spoke again. "Let me tell you why I came to this territory," he said. "There have been reports, over the past several months, of unusual disturbances near several packs along this region's borders. Wolves reporting a scent they couldn't identify, livestock disturbed by something larger and stranger than any known predator, and, more recently, whispers of a bloodline that was believed to have been eliminated generations ago, one that carries a particular significance for wolves like myself." He paused, watching her reaction carefully, and Lyra forced herself to remain still, to betray nothing, despite the roaring in her ears. The White Wolf bloodline, he continued, was hunted nearly to extinction many years ago, for reasons that had far more to do with fear and superstition than any genuine threat. But there is an old prophecy, one most modern wolves dismiss as nothing more than legend, that speaks of a white wolf destined to stand beside the Alpha King and unite the fractured packs of this region under a single, lasting peace. Lyra's breath caught in her throat, though she fought desperately to keep the reaction from showing on her face. I don't put much stock in prophecies generally, he continued, his gaze never leaving hers. But I take reports of disturbances seriously, and I take rumors of a surviving bloodline seriously enough to investigate them personally, rather than leaving the matter to subordinates, who might handle it with less care than the situation deserves. That's a very interesting story, Lyra managed, proud of how level her voice remained despite the storm raging inside her. But I'm not sure what any of it has to do with me. Perhaps nothing. He held her gaze for a long, unbearable moment. Or perhaps everything. I haven't decided yet. The door opened before Lyra could formulate any response, and one of the king's advisors stepped inside, murmuring something urgent in his ear. Cale's expression shifted immediately, the sharp focus he'd been directing at Lyra, redirecting entirely toward whatever news had just been delivered. He rose from his chair, all business now, and addressed her without the careful, probing tone he'd used moments before. We'll continue this conversation another time, he said. You're free to go. Lyra didn't need to be told twice. She rose from her chair on unsteady legs and made her way toward the door, forcing herself to walk rather than run, despite every instinct urging her to flee the room as quickly as possible. She was nearly through the doorway when his voice stopped her one final time. Lyra. She turned, heart hammering, to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, something caught between suspicion and an entirely different kind of interest that unsettled her almost as much as his earlier questions had. Be careful with that wolfsbane tea, he said. In the wrong doses, it can be dangerous. She left the room without responding, her mind spinning too fast to form a coherent reply. He knew about the tea. He'd made the connection between her herb gathering and some deeper purpose, even if he hadn't stated the accusation outright. The careful, controlled panic she'd been managing for days threatened to overwhelm her entirely as she made her way back through the packhouse grounds, and it was only sheer force of will that kept her walking steadily, rather than breaking into a run. She found Elena in the garden and relayed the conversation in a low, urgent whisper, watching the older woman's face grow paler with each detail. He mentioned the prophecy, Elena said quietly, once Lyra had finished. That is not a good sign, Lyra. If he genuinely believes the old stories, he will not stop investigating until he's satisfied one way or another. What do I do? Elena was quiet for a long moment, her expression troubled in a way that did nothing to ease Lyra's rising panic. For now, you continue as we discussed. You stay careful. But Lyra, I think it may be time to consider leaving this territory entirely, at least until the king's visit concludes. The suggestion hit Lyra harder than she expected. This territory, this small collection of cottages and gardens and familiar faces, was the only home she had known since her mother's death. The thought of abandoning it, of running once again the way she and her mother had run so many years ago, filled her with a grief so sudden and sharp it nearly stole her breath. Where would I even go? I don't know, Elena admitted. But if the Alpha King is determined enough, staying here may become more dangerous than leaving. Lyra didn't have an answer for that, and the conversation drifted into uneasy silence as the two women worked side by side in the garden, each lost in her own anxious thoughts about what the coming days might bring. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of forced normalcy, Lyra going through the motions of her usual routine, while her mind remained fixed on the conversation in that small room, on the weight of the Alpha King's gaze, on the terrifying possibility that Elena might be right about needing to leave. She was gathering the last of the day's harvest from the garden when a new voice interrupted her thoughts, one carrying none of the warmth she was used to from her fellow pack members. You spent quite a while alone with the Alpha King today. Lyra turned to find Victor Kane watching her from the garden's edge, arms crossed, expression carrying the particular blend of suspicion and self-importance that had made him one of the more unpleasant members of the pack in Lyra's estimation. Victor had never liked her, though she'd never been entirely certain why, beyond some instinctive dislike he seemed to harbor for anyone who kept to themselves the way she did. "I was summoned," she said carefully. "I didn't have much choice in the matter." "Interesting, isn't it?" Victor's eyes narrowed slightly, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with unease. The king arrives, mentions rumors of some hidden bloodline, and suddenly he's spending private time with the one member of this pack nobody really knows anything about. Lyra's stomach twisted, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. "I don't know what you're implying, Victor." "I'm not implying anything." His smile carried no warmth at all. "I'm simply making an observation. But if I were you, Lyra, I'd be very careful about whatever secrets you might be keeping. The Alpha King has a reputation for uncovering exactly the kinds of things people work hardest to hide." He walked away before she could formulate a response, leaving her standing alone in the fading afternoon light, with a fresh wave of dread settling over her. Victor's suspicion was nothing new, exactly, but the timing of his comments, so soon after her private conversation with the king, felt like more than mere coincidence. If Victor had noticed her prolonged absence and connected it to the rumors circulating about the bloodline, there was no telling how many others in the pack might be drawing similar conclusions. The walls Lyra had spent 5 careful years building around her secret were beginning to feel less like protection and more like a trap slowly closing in around her, and she had no idea, as she made her way back toward her cottage in the gathering dusk, how much longer she would be able to hold it together. Sleep offered little comfort that night, and Lyra rose before dawn the next morning, with dark circles beneath her eyes and a heaviness in her chest that no amount of rest seemed likely to cure. She brewed her tea with extra care, measuring the wolfsbane root precisely, unwilling to risk another lapse in control after everything that had happened over the past few days. The bitter liquid settled uneasily in her stomach as she drank it, and she sat alone at her small kitchen table afterward, staring out the window at the gray morning light, turning Elena's suggestion over and over in her mind. Leaving felt like defeat. Leaving felt like abandoning the only home she had ever truly known, the small collection of familiar faces and familiar paths that had, despite everything, become something precious to her over the years. But staying felt increasingly like walking a tightrope with no safety net beneath her, one misstep away from a fall she might never recover from. She was still lost in these anxious thoughts when a soft knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find Owen standing on her step, his expression carrying none of its usual easy warmth. "Have you heard?" he asked without preamble. "There's going to be a formal council meeting this evening. All pack members are required to attend." Lyra's stomach dropped. "What kind of council meeting?" "Nobody's saying exactly, but the rumor is it has something to do with the king's investigation." Owen's eyes carried a worry that mirrored her own. "Victor's been going around telling people he thinks the king suspects someone in our pack of hiding something serious, something dangerous." The words landed like a physical blow, confirming every fear that had been building in Lyra since her conversation with the Alpha King the day before. If Victor had been spreading suspicion through the pack, if a formal council meeting had been called so soon after her private conversation with the king, the timing felt far too deliberate to be coincidence. "Do you know when?" she asked, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. "Sundown." "Everyone's supposed to be there." Owen studied her face for a moment, his brow furrowing with concern. "Lyra, is something wrong? You look terrified." "I'm just tired," she said, the lie coming automatically, even as her mind raced through the implications of what he'd just told her. "I didn't sleep well." Owen didn't look entirely convinced, but he let the matter drop, offering a few more details about the gathering, before excusing himself to spread word to other pack members. Lyra closed the door behind him and pressed her back against it, closing her eyes, trying to force her racing thoughts into some kind of order. A formal council meeting, mandatory for all pack members, called just one day after the Alpha King had questioned her privately about a hidden bloodline. It could be coincidence, it could be entirely unrelated to her at all, but every instinct she possessed told her otherwise, and those instincts had kept her alive and hidden for 5 long years. She had learned, painfully, not to ignore them. She found Elena in the packhouse kitchen a short while later, and the older woman's face confirmed what Lyra had already suspected before she'd even finished explaining what Owen had told her. "This is what I feared," Elena said quietly, setting down the bowl she'd been holding with hands that trembled slightly. If the king is calling a formal gathering, he intends to address the matter publicly. That is far more dangerous than a private conversation. "What do I do?" Lyra asked, hating the note of desperation she heard creeping into her own voice. "I can't just not attend. Everyone will notice." "No," Elena agreed grimly. "Absenting yourself now would only draw more suspicion, not less. You'll have to attend, and you'll have to maintain your composure no matter what is said or asked of you. And if he asks me directly, in front of the entire pack?" Elena's expression grew even graver, though she seemed to choose her next words with careful deliberation. "Then you will do exactly what you have always done. You will deny it, calmly and convincingly, and you will trust that 5 years of careful practice have prepared you for exactly this kind of moment." The words offered little genuine comfort, but Lyra nodded regardless, understanding that there was no other viable path forward. Running now would be an admission of guilt. Hiding would only delay the inevitable. Her only option was to face whatever came at the council meeting with as much composure as she could manage, and hope, against every instinct screaming otherwise, that it would be enough. The hours leading up to sundown passed in an agonizing blur. Lyra tried to distract herself with ordinary tasks, but her hands trembled too much for anything requiring real precision, and she eventually gave up entirely, choosing instead to sit alone in her cottage and mentally rehearse every possible question she might be asked, every careful denial she might need to offer. She thought of her mother again, of the fierce, protective love that had driven her to fight against impossible odds, rather than let her daughter be discovered. She thought of the promise she had made, as a frightened 6-year-old, a promise she had kept faithfully for nearly 2 decades. She would not let that promise break now, not without a fight. When the time finally came, she dressed carefully, choosing clothing plain and unremarkable enough not to draw any additional attention, and made her way toward the large meeting hall where pack members were already beginning to gather. The atmosphere was tense and heavy, whispered conversations filling the space with a nervous energy that seemed to press against Lyra's skin like a physical weight. She found a spot near the back of the crowd, close enough to a support beam that she could press her shoulder against it, drawing what small comfort she could from the solid, unmoving presence of the wood beneath her palm. Elena appeared beside her a moment later, her expression carefully composed despite the tension Lyra could sense radiating from her. "Stay calm," Elena murmured, so quietly only Lyra could hear. "Whatever happens, stay calm." The crowd's murmuring died away as the Alpha King entered the hall, flanked by several of his advisors and guards, his presence commanding immediate and absolute silence from everyone gathered. He moved to the front of the hall with the same unhurried confidence Lyra had witnessed the night of his arrival, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried easily to every corner of the crowded room without any apparent effort. "I want to thank you all for gathering on such short notice," he began, his gaze sweeping slowly across the assembled pack members. "I know my presence here has caused some concern, and I intend to address that concern directly, rather than allowing rumor and speculation to continue unchecked." Lyra's heart pounded so loudly, she was certain the wolves standing nearest to her could hear it, but she kept her expression carefully composed, her eyes fixed respectfully on the king, rather than betraying the panic churning beneath her calm exterior. "There have been reports, in recent months, of unusual disturbances across several territories in this region," he continued. "Reports that have led me to investigate the possibility of a surviving bloodline, one believed extinct for generations, that carries particular significance for the future stability of all packs under my authority." The crowd's murmuring rose again, curious and uneasy in equal measure, before quieting once more, as the king raised a hand for silence. "I have reason to believe," he said, his voice measured and deliberate, "that this territory may hold answers relevant to my investigation. I do not say this to cause alarm, or to cast suspicion on any individual pack member, but I would ask that anyone with information relevant to this matter come forward, now or in private, so that we may resolve this situation as quickly and as peacefully as possible." Silence fell across the hall, thick and expectant, every pack member exchanging uncertain glances as they waited to see if anyone would respond to the king's request. Lyra kept perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs, acutely aware of Elena's tense presence beside her, and of Victor Kane's narrowed eyes scanning the crowd from somewhere near the front of the gathering. No one came forward. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, before the king finally continued, his expression unreadable. "Very well," he said. "Then I will conduct my investigation through other means. I would ask that all pack members cooperate fully with my advisors over the coming days, and that anyone approached with questions answer them honestly and completely." Lyra felt the weight of his words settle over her like a physical burden, understanding immediately what they meant for her own precarious situation. The investigation was not concluding. It was only beginning, and it would now extend far beyond the private conversations she had already endured, reaching into every corner of pack life, until whatever truth the king sought was finally uncovered. The meeting continued for a while longer, the king addressing a few additional matters related to territory boundaries and pack governance, but Lyra absorbed almost none of it, her mind consumed entirely by the dread of what was still to come. When the gathering finally dispersed, she found herself moving on autopilot, following the crowd out of the hall and into the cool evening air, without any real awareness of the steps she was taking. "That could have been worse," Elena said quietly, as they walked together back toward their cottage, though her tone carried little genuine reassurance. "It could have been much better too," Lyra replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's not going to stop looking, Elena. Not until he finds what he's searching for." Elena said nothing for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a weariness Lyra had rarely heard from the normally composed older woman. "No," she agreed. "I don't believe he will." They walked the rest of the way in silence, each lost in her own anxious thoughts about the days ahead, and Lyra couldn't shake the growing certainty that whatever fragile control she had maintained over her secret for the past 5 years was beginning, inexorably, to slip through her fingers. Over the following days, the king's advisors moved through the territory like a slow, methodical tide, questioning pack members one by one about their histories, their bloodlines, their movements on the night of the king's arrival. Lyra watched the process unfold with mounting dread, knowing that her own interview was only a matter of time, and doing her best to prepare herself for whatever questions might come. Her turn arrived on the 3rd day, delivered not by a summons from the king himself this time, but by a formal request from one of his senior advisors, a stern-faced woman named Ruth, who conducted her interviews with clinical precision in a small room set aside for the purpose. Lyra answered every question carefully, drawing on the same practiced calm that had served her through years of careful concealment, and when the interview concluded nearly an hour later, she left the room with her nerves frayed but her secret, as far as she could tell, still intact. It was 2 days after that interview, while she was helping Elena prepare the evening meal, that she felt the first unmistakable tremor of an approaching shift. It came without warning, a sudden heat spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the stove she stood beside, a tightness in her jaw that signaled her teeth beginning to lengthen. She set down the knife she'd been using, with hands that had begun to shake, gripping the edge of the counter, as the sensation intensified faster than anything she had experienced in years. "Lyra?" Elena's voice carried immediate alarm. "What's wrong?" "I don't know," Lyra managed through gritted teeth. "It's happening too fast. The tea isn't holding it back." Elena moved quickly, guiding her toward a chair, pressing a cool cloth to the back of her neck, while murmuring the same calming techniques she had taught Lyra so many years before. But even as Lyra tried desperately to focus on her breathing, to force the rising tide of transformation back down, through sheer force of will, she could feel it slipping further out of her control than it had in longer than she could remember. "The stress," Elena murmured, half to herself, working quickly to close the curtains and lock the cottage door. "The king's investigation, the constant fear, it's wearing down your control faster than the tea can compensate. This is dangerous, Lyra." "I know," Lyra gasped, feeling her claws beginning to push against her fingertips despite everything she was doing to hold them back. "I know." It took nearly 20 minutes of careful, exhausting effort before the tremors finally began to subside, leaving Lyra collapsed in the chair, drenched in sweat, shaking with the aftermath of the near transformation. Elena knelt beside her, gripping her hands, her expression carrying a fear that did nothing to ease Lyra's own mounting panic. "This can't continue," Elena said, once Lyra's breathing had steadied enough for conversation. "The tea alone isn't going to be enough anymore. Not with this much stress weighing on you constantly. What else can I do?" Elena hesitated, and something in her expression made Lyra's stomach tighten with fresh apprehension. There may be a way to strengthen the suppressant, using ingredients that don't grow naturally in this territory, but it would mean traveling beyond our borders, into territory currently patrolled by the King's own guards. The risk was obvious, and Lyra shook her head immediately. That's too dangerous. If I'm caught leaving the territory now, of all times, it will only confirm every suspicion he already has. Then we're running out of options, Elena said grimly. You cannot continue like this, Lyra. Sooner or later, your control will fail completely, and it may not happen in the privacy of this cottage next time. The warning settled over Lyra with a weight that made the room feel suddenly much smaller, much more suffocating than it had a few minutes before. She knew Elena was right. She had felt the difference in this latest episode, the way her control had slipped faster and further than it ever had before, and she understood, with a clarity that terrified her, that the constant fear of discovery was doing more damage to her carefully maintained composure than 5 years of careful practice could withstand indefinitely. She spent the following days in a state of near constant vigilance, monitoring every tremor, every flicker of heat beneath her skin, terrified of another episode catching her somewhere less private than her own kitchen. She avoided crowds when possible, kept to quiet, isolated tasks, and drank her suppressant tea with an almost obsessive regularity, desperate to maintain whatever fragile control she still possessed. It was during one of these careful, isolated walks through the eastern woods, seeking the calm she could no longer find within the crowded pack house, that she encountered the Alpha King for the 3rd time. He was alone again, without his usual retinue of guards and advisors, moving through the trees with the same quiet, deliberate presence she remembered from their first encounter. Lyra froze the moment she spotted him, every instinct urging her to turn and flee before he noticed her, but it was already too late. His sharp eyes found her almost immediately, and something in his expression shifted as he took in her pale, exhausted features. You look unwell, he said, closing the distance between them with slow, unhurried steps. Has something happened? I'm fine, Lyra said, the automatic denial coming even as exhaustion made it harder than usual to maintain her composure. Just tired. He studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression suggested he didn't entirely believe her, though he didn't press the matter further. Walk with me, he said instead, gesturing toward a narrow path that wound deeper into the trees. I find these woods clear my mind. Perhaps they'll do the same for you. It wasn't a request Lyra felt she could refuse, not without drawing more suspicion than she could afford, so she fell into step beside him, keeping careful distance between them, despite the strange pull she felt toward his quiet, steady presence. They walked in silence for a while, the only sounds the crunch of leaves beneath their feet and the distant calls of birds settling in for the evening. You've lived a very guarded life, he said eventually, breaking the silence without any preamble. I've noticed it in every conversation we've had. You measure your words carefully. You reveal almost nothing about yourself. Some people simply prefer privacy. Perhaps. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the fading afternoon light. But I've spent centuries studying wolves, Lyra. I know the difference between someone who values privacy and someone who is actively hiding something out of fear. You carry yourself like the latter. Lyra said nothing, unsure how to respond without either confirming or denying something she desperately needed to keep hidden. He seemed to sense her discomfort, and rather than pressing further, he changed the subject, his tone shifting into something gentler, almost curious. Tell me something true then, he said. Not about your bloodline, not about whatever secrets you're keeping, just something true about yourself. The request caught her off guard, and for a moment, she considered deflecting entirely, offering another careful non-answer, designed to reveal nothing. But something in his tone, some quality she couldn't quite name, made her hesitate, made her want, however briefly, to offer him something real. I lost my mother when I was very young, she said finally, the words coming slowly, carefully edited to avoid any dangerous detail. I've spent most of my life since then feeling like I don't quite belong anywhere, like I'm always watching from the outside, never fully part of things. He was quiet for a long moment, studying her, with an expression that had softened, if only slightly, from its usual sharp assessment. That sounds like a lonely way to live. It is, she admitted, surprised by her own honesty. But it's also safer. Safer from what? The question hung in the air between them, and Lyra felt the familiar panic rise in her chest, aware that she had already revealed more than she'd intended. "From getting hurt," she said finally, offering the vaguest, safest answer she could manage. "From losing people the way I lost my mother." Something flickered across his expression, something that looked almost like understanding, and for a moment, the sharp, calculating king she had grown accustomed to seemed to soften into something more human, more approachable. "Loss changes people," he said quietly. "I understand that better than you might expect." They walked in silence for a while longer after that, and Lyra found herself, despite every instinct warning her against it, beginning to feel something almost like ease in his presence. It frightened her more than his earlier suspicion had, this strange, unwelcome pull she felt toward him, this dangerous temptation to let her guard down even slightly in his company. She excused herself as soon as she reasonably could, citing the lateness of the hour, and made her way back toward the pack house with her thoughts in even greater disarray than before their encounter. She had spent 5 years building walls to keep everyone at a careful distance, and in the span of a few short conversations, the Alpha King, of all people, had somehow found cracks in that careful architecture that no one else had ever managed to locate. It was a dangerous kind of vulnerability, one she could not afford to indulge, no matter how strange and unexpected the pull toward him had become. That night, alone in her cottage, Lyra sat awake long after the moon had risen, turning over every moment of their conversation in her mind, trying to reconcile the careful, suspicious king, who had questioned her so pointedly in that small room, with the quieter, more thoughtful man who had walked beside her through the trees. She didn't understand him, and she certainly didn't trust him, not with the secret she carried, but something had shifted between them regardless, some fragile thread of connection she hadn't expected and couldn't quite bring herself to sever. She fell asleep eventually, exhausted by days of constant vigilance, and did not wake until the first gray light of dawn began creeping through her window, carrying with it the uneasy certainty that whatever fragile equilibrium she had maintained was growing more precarious with each passing day. The summons came sooner than Lyra expected, and from a source she hadn't anticipated. She was gathering water from the well near the center of the pack house grounds when Victor Kane approached, flanked by 2 other pack members whose expressions carried the same self-satisfied suspicion that had become increasingly familiar over the past week. Lyra set down her bucket carefully, bracing herself for whatever confrontation was clearly about to unfold. "There's a full moon gathering tomorrow night," Victor said without preamble, his voice pitched deliberately loud enough to draw the attention of nearby pack members. "I think it's time you attended one, Lyra. Don't you agree?" The question carried a weight far beyond its simple words, and Lyra felt her stomach drop as she understood immediately what Victor was implying. "I've never been fond of large gatherings," she said carefully. "You know that." "I do know that." Victor's smile carried no warmth at all. "In fact, it's quite remarkable how consistently you've avoided every full moon gathering for as long as I've known you. 5 years, by my count. That's a long time to avoid something every other wolf in this pack looks forward to." More pack members had begun to gather now, drawn by the rising volume of Victor's voice and the obvious tension crackling in the air. Lyra felt the weight of their curious stares pressing down on her, and she fought to keep her expression neutral despite the panic building rapidly in her chest. "Some wolves simply prefer quieter company," she said, though even to her own ears, the excuse sounded thin and rehearsed after years of repetition. "Perhaps." Victor's gaze swept across the gathering crowd, clearly relishing the attention his accusation was drawing. "Or perhaps there's another reason you've spent 5 years avoiding the one event where every wolf in this pack shifts openly, together, under the full moon. A reason that might explain the king's sudden and very particular interest in this territory." The implication hung in the air, unmistakable and devastating, and Lyra felt the ground shift beneath her feet as she realized exactly how public and how dangerous this confrontation had become. "I don't know what you're suggesting, Victor, but I resent the implication." "Then prove me wrong." Victor's voice rang out clearly across the gathered crowd. "Attend tomorrow's gathering. Shift with the rest of us, in the open, where everyone can see. If you have nothing to hide, that shouldn't be a difficult request." Lyra's mind raced desperately, searching for some way out of the trap that had just closed around her in front of dozens of watching pack members, refusing now, in this moment, in front of this crowd, would be tantamount to confirming every suspicion Victor had just voiced aloud. But shifting openly, in front of the entire pack and whatever guards or advisors the king might have observing the gathering, would expose the very secret she had spent 5 years protecting. There was no answer that didn't lead toward disaster. "I don't answer to you, Victor," she said finally, forcing as much steel into her voice as she could manage. "If the pack elders have concerns about my attendance at gatherings, they can address them directly." "Oh, I think they will." Victor's smile widened, cold and triumphant. "In fact, I believe someone already has." The crowd parted slightly, and Lyra's blood turned to ice as she saw the Alpha King approaching, his expression carrying none of the softened warmth she had glimpsed during their walk through the woods days before. Whatever fragile connection had begun to form between them in private seemed to have vanished entirely, replaced by the sharp, authoritative bearing of a ruler addressing a matter of pack law. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice carrying easily across the now silent crowd. "No problem, my king," Victor said quickly, though his triumphant expression suggested he was delighted by the king's timely arrival. "I was simply pointing out that Lyra here has avoided every full moon gathering for the past 5 years. Given everything we've discussed about the ongoing investigation, I thought it worth mentioning." The king's gaze shifted to Lyra, and she saw something flicker across his features, some complicated mixture of assessment and, unless she was imagining it, a flash of something almost like regret. "Is this true?" he asked her directly. "Have you avoided the pack's gatherings?" There was no room left for evasion, not with the entire crowd watching, not with Victor's accusation already hanging so publicly in the air. "I've always preferred solitude during the full moon," she said, choosing her words as carefully as she could manage, under the weight of so many watching eyes. "I don't see why that should be treated as suspicious. Perhaps it shouldn't be, on its own." The king's expression remained carefully neutral, giving away nothing of his true thoughts. "But given the circumstances of my investigation, I think it would be wise to resolve any lingering doubt one way or another." Lyra's heart pounded so violently, she was certain everyone around her could see it in the pulse at her throat. "What are you suggesting?" "Tomorrow night's gathering will proceed as planned," he said, his voice carrying the absolute, unquestionable authority of a ruler whose word was law, across every territory he governed. "All pack members will shift together, in the open, under the full moon. This will apply to every member of this pack, without exception." The words landed like a death sentence, and Lyra felt the blood drain from her face despite every effort to maintain her composure. Every member, he confirmed, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that seemed to carry some hidden message she couldn't quite decipher. "Including you, Lyra Ashworth." The crowd's murmuring rose around them, curious and speculative, but Lyra barely heard any of it, her mind consumed entirely by the impossible situation that had just been forced upon her. There would be no more avoiding gatherings, no more careful excuses about preferring solitude. Tomorrow night, under the full moon, in front of the entire pack and the Alpha King himself, she would be required to shift openly, in plain sight, with no possible way to hide the truth she had spent 5 years protecting. She wanted to protest, to argue, to find some clever excuse that might delay the inevitable even a little longer. But looking into the king's eyes, seeing the absolute authority and unwavering determination there, she understood with a sinking certainty that no argument she could offer would change his decision. The command had been given, publicly, in front of witnesses, and there was no possible way to refuse without confirming every suspicion Victor had already voiced. "Understood," she managed, the word feeling like ash in her mouth. The king held her gaze for one more long moment, before turning to address the rest of the gathered crowd, his voice carrying the same commanding authority as he outlined the details of the following evening's ceremony. Lyra barely absorbed any of it, her mind consumed entirely by panic, by the desperate, useless search for some solution to a problem that felt, for the first time in 5 years, genuinely unsolvable. She found Elena as soon as the crowd began to disperse, pulling the older woman aside into the relative privacy of a narrow alley between 2 cottages, and relayed everything that had just happened in a rushed, panicked whisper. Elena's face grew progressively paler with each detail, until by the time Lyra finished, the older woman looked as though she might be sick. "This is a disaster," Elena said quietly, her voice trembling with barely suppressed fear. "There's no way to avoid this, Lyra. Not now. Not with the entire pack watching and the king himself giving the order directly." "I know." Lyra's own voice shook with the weight of the realization settling over her. "I don't know what to do, Elena. I can't refuse. I can't run. And I can't hide what I am. Not from an entire pack watching me shift in the open." Elena was quiet for a long moment, her expression carrying a grief and fear that Lyra had rarely seen from the normally composed woman who had raised her. "Then perhaps," she said finally, so quietly, Lyra almost didn't hear the words, "it's time to accept that the truth is going to come out, one way or another. The only choice you have left is how you face it when it does." The words offered no real comfort, but Lyra understood, with a clarity that settled cold and heavy in her chest, that Elena was right. 5 years of careful hiding, of desperate suppressant tea, and avoided gatherings, and painstakingly maintained lies, had led inevitably to this single, unavoidable moment. Tomorrow night, under the full moon, in front of the entire pack and the most powerful wolf in the region, her secret would finally be exposed. There was no more room left to run. The following day passed in a blur of dread that Lyra would later struggle to fully remember. She spent the morning hours in restless, anxious pacing, unable to settle into any task for more than a few minutes, before her mind spiraled back toward the impossible evening ahead. Elena tried, gently, to offer what comfort she could, but there was little either of them could say that might ease the crushing weight of what was coming. By mid-afternoon, Lyra had exhausted every possible plan, every desperate scheme for escape or deception, and had arrived, reluctantly, at the same grim conclusion Elena had voiced the day before. There was no way out. There was only the matter of facing what came next. She drank her suppressant tea one final time as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, though she harbored no real illusions about its effectiveness. The gathering would demand a full, deliberate shift from every pack member present, and no amount of wolfsbane root would allow her to fake compliance without revealing the truth she had fought so hard to protect. Tonight, for the first time in 5 years, she would have to let her wolf free in front of witnesses. The thought terrified her, and, in some small, buried corner of her heart she barely dared to acknowledge, filled her with something achingly close to relief. As dusk settled over the territory, pack members began making their way toward the wide clearing at the heart of the woods where full moon gatherings had always been held, a space Lyra had avoided for 5 long years, familiar to her only through the distant sounds of joyful howling that used to drift toward her cottage on clear nights. She walked there now beside Elena, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The clearing was already filling with pack members by the time they arrived, torches lit around its perimeter, casting flickering golden light across faces that carried a mixture of excitement and, in a few cases, the same curious suspicion Victor had been so eager to cultivate over the past several days. Lyra kept close to Elena's side, scanning the gathering crowd for any sign of the king, and found him standing near the center of the clearing, flanked by his advisors, his expression carrying the same unreadable authority she had come to associate with his public presence. His eyes found hers almost immediately, and for one brief moment, Lyra thought she saw something flicker across his features, some complicated emotion she couldn't quite name. Then his expression settled back into careful neutrality, and he turned his attention to addressing the gathered crowd, his voice carrying easily across the clearing as the last stragglers arrived, and the full assembly of the pack settled into place. "Tonight's gathering will proceed as tradition dictates," he announced, his gaze sweeping across the crowd with the same authoritative weight it always carried. "Every wolf present will shift together, under the full moon, as one unified pack." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering, and Lyra felt Victor's gaze find her from across the clearing, his expression carrying an unmistakable satisfaction that made her stomach twist with dread. She kept her own expression carefully composed, though every instinct screamed at her to flee, to run into the trees and never look back, consequences be damned. The moon rose slowly above the tree line, full and bright and terrible in its beauty, and Lyra felt the familiar pull begin to build within her, the same insistent call she had spent 5 years learning to suppress. Around her, pack members began shedding their outer clothing in preparation, the ritual as familiar to them as breathing, while Lyra stood frozen, her heart hammering so violently she could barely think past the roar of blood in her ears. Lyra. Elena's voice was barely a whisper beside her, urgent and fearful. It's time. There was nothing left to do but comply. Refusing now, in front of the entire pack and the Alpha King himself, would only invite exactly the kind of scrutiny she had spent 5 years desperately trying to avoid. She removed her outer clothing with trembling hands, aware of the curious glances beginning to turn her way from pack members who had noticed, perhaps for the first time, how rarely they had ever actually seen her participate in this ritual. The moonlight fell fully across the clearing now, bathing every wolf and every waiting human form in silver light, and Lyra felt the pull toward transformation building within her, with an intensity she had never before allowed herself to fully experience. Around her, the first pack members began to shift, their bodies contorting and reshaping with the fluid, practiced ease of wolves who had never once needed to fear their own nature. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in 5 years, she stopped fighting. The sensation that followed was unlike anything she remembered from the rare, panicked near shifts she had barely managed to control over the years. This time, without resistance, without the desperate mental effort of forcing her wolf back down, the transformation moved through her like water finding its natural course, swift and inevitable and, despite everything, achingly beautiful. Her bones reshaped themselves with a speed that would have been agonizing if she'd fought against it, but surrendered to fully. The change felt almost like exhaling after years of held breath. When it was finished, she stood on 4 paws instead of 2, her body covered not in the brown or gray or black fur common to every other wolf in the clearing, but in fur so purely, luminously white it seemed to gather and hold the moonlight itself, glowing faintly against the darkness of the surrounding trees. Silence fell across the clearing like a physical blow. Every wolf and every remaining human form turned toward her, eyes wide with shock, with fear, with something that looked, in more than a few faces, disturbingly close to reverence. Lyra stood frozen at the center of all that attention, her wolf's heart pounding, as violently as her human heart had moments before, every instinct urging her to run, to flee into the trees and disappear, before anyone could react to what they were seeing. But there was nowhere left to run. 5 years of careful hiding had led, inevitably, to this single, terrible moment, and there was no possible way to take it back, now that it had happened. "It's true," someone whispered from somewhere in the crowd, the words carrying easily across the stunned silence of the clearing. "The White Wolf, it's actually true." More voices rose around her, some fearful, some awestruck, the crowd's reaction building into a confused, overwhelming wave of sound that pressed against Lyra's heightened senses like a physical assault. She caught sight of Victor near the edge of the gathering, his expression carrying a triumphant satisfaction that made her wolf's hackles rise with something close to fury, but her attention was drawn, inevitably, unstoppably, toward the center of the clearing, where the Alpha King stood watching her, with an expression she had never seen him wear before. Gone was the sharp, calculating suspicion that had defined every previous encounter between them. In its place was something Lyra could barely comprehend, a mixture of shock and wonder, and something else entirely, something that looked, impossibly, like recognition. He took a slow step toward her, and the crowd's murmuring quieted slightly, every eye in the clearing now fixed on the unfolding scene at its center. Lyra's wolf instincts screamed at her to flee, but some deeper part of her, some part that had spent 5 long years desperate for exactly this moment of terrible, freeing exposure, held her frozen in place, watching him approach with a strange, breathless anticipation she couldn't fully explain. "The White Wolf," he said quietly, his voice carrying only to those nearest the center of the clearing, though Lyra's heightened senses caught every word with perfect clarity. "I wondered, from the very first moment I saw you, if the old stories might be true." Lyra had no way to respond in her current form, no words available to her beyond the low, uncertain whine that rose unbidden from her throat. But something in her posture, some silent, involuntary plea for understanding, seemed to communicate itself clearly enough, because the king's expression softened further as he studied her, the sharp authority of his usual bearing giving way to something gentler, something that looked, absurdly, like awe. Behind him, the crowd's murmuring had begun to shift, curiosity and fear giving way to something more complicated, as pack members, exchanged uncertain glances, clearly uncertain how to react to a revelation that upended everything they thought they knew about the quiet, unremarkable woman who had lived among them for 5 years. "She's dangerous," Victor's voice cut through the tension, loud and demanding, as he pushed forward through the crowd. "That bloodline was hunted down for good reason, my king. She's been lying to us, hiding among us for years. Who knows what she might be capable of?" A ripple of uncertain agreement moved through parts of the crowd, and Lyra felt her wolf's instincts flare, with a fear that had nothing to do with physical danger, and everything to do with the terrible, familiar sensation of watching safety collapse around her, exactly as it had the night her mother died. She took an involuntary step backward, every muscle tensed for flight, when the king's voice cut through the rising tension with absolute, unquestionable authority. "Enough." The single word carried such weight that the entire clearing fell silent immediately, every eye turning toward him as he stepped forward, positioning himself between Lyra and the gathered crowd, with a deliberateness that felt, unmistakably, protective. "This wolf has done nothing but survive," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed clearing. "Whatever fear you carry about her bloodline is rooted in old superstition, not present danger. I will not allow that superstition to become an excuse for cruelty in my presence." Victor's expression flickered with surprise, quickly masked behind a careful neutrality, but he said nothing further, apparently unwilling to challenge the king's authority so directly in front of the entire gathered pack. The crowd's tension eased slightly, though uncertain murmuring continued to ripple through the clearing as pack members absorbed the shocking reality that had just been revealed before them. The king turned back toward Lyra, and something in his expression, some careful gentleness she had never expected to see from him, eased the frantic pounding of her wolf's heart just slightly. "You have nothing to fear from me," he said quietly. Meant, she understood, only for her. "Whatever comes next, you have my protection." Lyra had no way to respond, no words available to her in this form, but she felt something shift within her regardless, some fragile, cautious hope beginning to take root beneath the overwhelming fear and exposure of the moment. For 5 years, she had believed that discovery would mean nothing but danger, nothing but the same fate that had claimed her mother. Standing now in the moonlit clearing, watching the most powerful wolf in the region position himself between her and a fearful, uncertain crowd, she began to wonder, for the first time, if she had been wrong. The gathering slowly began to disperse around them, pack members retreating in uncertain clusters, whispering amongst themselves as they processed everything they had just witnessed. Elena remained close by, her expression carrying a complicated mixture of fear and relief, watching Lyra with the same protective vigilance she had maintained since the night she'd found a terrified, orphaned child alone in the woods. Lyra felt the pull of her human form calling to her, the shift as instinctive in reverse as it had been in transformation, and she let it take her, the change washing over her with the same fluid ease as before. When it was finished, she stood once more on 2 legs, breathing hard, her bare skin prickling in the cool night air, acutely aware of the king's steady gaze still fixed on her. "I don't understand," she managed finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you protect me? You spent days investigating me, suspecting me." "I spent days trying to understand what you were," he corrected gently, "not trying to condemn you for it. There's a difference, Lyra, even if it wasn't always clear from where you stood." The words offered little immediate comfort, but something in his steady, sincere expression made her want, desperately, to believe them. For 5 years, she had known nothing but fear and careful hiding. Standing now in the aftermath of her secret's exposure, with the Alpha King himself standing as her unexpected protector, she found herself facing a future she had never once allowed herself to imagine. Uncertain and terrifying and, despite everything, carrying the first fragile threads of something that might, eventually, become hope. The days that followed the gathering brought a strange, disorienting shift in Lyra's daily life, one she found herself struggling to navigate after 5 years of careful, practiced invisibility. Word of her true nature had spread through the entire territory within hours, and beyond it, she suspected, into neighboring packs within days. She caught pack members watching her now, with expressions ranging from open curiosity to lingering suspicion, to, more unsettling still, a kind of reverent awe she had never expected and didn't know how to accept. She had spent 5 years working desperately to be unremarkable, and now, overnight, she had become the single most remarkable person in the entire territory. Elena remained close by throughout those first disorienting days, offering quiet support, even as she navigated her own complicated feelings about a secret she had guarded so carefully finally coming to light. "You don't have to face any of this alone anymore," she told Lyra one evening, as they sat together in the cottage that had once felt like the safest place in the world, and now felt, oddly, like the last remaining piece of a life that no longer quite fit. That, at least, is one burden lifted. It was true, Lyra supposed, though the relief felt tangled and complicated alongside a grief she hadn't expected. The careful, hidden life she had built for herself, however exhausting and fearful, had also been entirely her own, controlled and predictable in ways that this new, exposed existence was not. The king summoned her formally 3 days after the gathering, and this time, walking toward the meeting hall, Lyra felt none of the sharp, immediate terror that had accompanied her previous visits. Something had shifted between them the night of her transformation, some fragile understanding that made the prospect of facing him now feel less like danger and more like an uncertain, cautious curiosity. He was alone when she arrived, seated near a window that overlooked the territory's central grounds, and he rose when she entered, gesturing toward a chair across from his own, with a courtesy that felt entirely different from the careful, probing questions of their previous meetings. "Thank you for coming," he said, his tone carrying none of the sharp authority she had grown accustomed to. "I wanted to speak with you properly, without an audience, about everything that's happened." Lyra lowered herself into the offered chair, studying him carefully, still uncertain how much to trust this gentler version of the man who had spent days investigating her with such relentless suspicion. "I think you owe me an explanation," she said finally, "about the prophecy you mentioned, about why my bloodline matters so much to you." He was quiet for a moment, as though gathering his thoughts, before he began speaking, his voice carrying a weight and seriousness she hadn't heard from him before. "The prophecy is old, older than most current pack records can properly trace. It speaks of a white wolf, born from a bloodline believed sacred by the earliest packs in this region, destined to stand beside the Alpha King during a time of great fracturing among the territories. Together, the prophecy claims, they would unite what conflict and fear had torn apart, bringing a lasting peace that had eluded every generation before them. That sounds like exactly the kind of story people tell to justify whatever they already want to believe, Lyra said, though her voice carried less skepticism than she'd intended. Perhaps, he acknowledged. I've spent much of my reign doubting it myself. But the packs under my authority have grown increasingly fractured over recent years, old rivalries resurfacing, disputes multiplying faster than I can resolve them through conventional means. When reports began reaching me of a possible surviving bloodline, I couldn't afford to dismiss the possibility, however unlikely it seemed. Lyra absorbed this in silence, turning the information over in her mind, trying to reconcile it with everything she'd been taught to fear about her own nature. My mother was killed because of that same bloodline, she said finally, the words carrying a grief she rarely allowed herself to voice aloud. Hunted down and killed by wolves who saw her as a threat, not a solution to anything. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of genuine sorrow that surprised her with its sincerity. I'm sorry, he said quietly. The fear that drove those attacks, the belief that your bloodline represented danger rather than possibility, has caused immeasurable harm over the generations. I understand if that history makes it difficult to trust anything I might tell you now. It does, Lyra admitted honestly. Why should I believe you're any different from the wolves who killed her? He held her gaze steadily, without flinching from the difficult question. Because I had every opportunity to condemn you, the night of the gathering, in front of the entire pack, and I chose instead to protect you. Because I could have ordered your bloodline investigated with far less patience and far more suspicion than I actually extended, and because, whatever the prophecy claims about our futures being intertwined, I've spent enough time in your company now to understand that you deserve protection, regardless of what any old story might predict. The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, and for a moment, Lyra found herself unable to formulate any response at all, caught between the deeply ingrained wariness of 5 years spent fearing exactly this kind of exposure, and a growing, cautious warmth toward the man sitting across from her. offering honesty in place of the suspicion she had expected. "What happens now?" she asked finally, unable to think of anything else to say. "That depends in part on you," he said. "I won't pretend the prophecy doesn't matter to me, or that the political implications of your existence aren't significant. But I also won't force any particular future upon you, simply because an old story suggests it. Whatever comes next, I want it to be something you choose, not something imposed upon you against your will." The words offered a kind of freedom Lyra hadn't expected, a genuine choice in a situation that had, until this moment, felt entirely beyond her control. "I don't know what I want," she admitted. "I've spent so long focused on hiding that I never really allowed myself to imagine what might come after." "Then perhaps," he suggested gently, "you don't need to decide everything at once. Perhaps it's enough, for now, simply to exist without fear, and see what choices present themselves as time goes on." It was a more generous offer than she had expected, and Lyra found herself, despite every carefully cultivated instinct toward caution, beginning to trust the sincerity behind it. They talked for a while longer, the conversation drifting into easier, less fraught territory, and by the time she finally left the meeting hall, the sun had begun to set over the territory, casting long golden shadows across ground she had walked in careful secrecy for 5 long years. For the first time in longer than she could remember, walking back toward her cottage in the fading evening light, Lyra allowed herself to feel something that wasn't fear. It was fragile, this new feeling, easily disturbed by the lingering suspicion of pack members like Victor, by the uncertain political weight of a prophecy she still didn't fully understand or trust. But beneath the fragility, something steadier was beginning to take root, a cautious hope that perhaps the future didn't have to mirror the tragedy of her past, that perhaps survival didn't always have to mean hiding. She didn't yet know what came next. But for the first time in 5 years, she found herself curious to find out, rather than terrified of the answer. The fragile peace Lyra had begun to find did not last long. It was Owen who brought her the first warning, arriving at her cottage early one morning, with an urgency that immediately set her nerves on edge. "There's talk," he said, out of breath from hurrying across the grounds, "of a group moving through the northern territories, wolves who don't belong to any recognized pack, asking questions about a white wolf sighting." Lyra's stomach dropped, old fear resurfacing with a speed that startled her, even after days of cautious hope. "How many of them?" "Nobody's certain. Word is they're well organized, though. Disciplined, like a hunting party rather than random wanderers." Owen's expression carried genuine concern. "Elena's already gone to inform the king." Lyra found Elena and the king together in the meeting hall a short while later, their expressions grave, a map of the surrounding territories spread across the table between them. The king looked up as she entered, and whatever relief she might have found in his steady, protective presence over the past several days was tempered now by the seriousness etched into his features. "You've heard the reports," he said, and Lyra nodded, moving closer to study the map, where several locations along the northern border had been marked with small, ominous symbols. "Who are they?" she asked. "Do you know?" "I have suspicions," he said grimly. "There's a group, operating largely in secret, that has spent generations tracking and eliminating what remains of the old sacred bloodlines. They call themselves purifiers, though there's nothing pure about the violence they've inflicted over the years. I believe they may be responsible for your mother's death, among many others." The words landed with a familiar, cold weight, dredging up memories Lyra had spent years trying to bury. "Their leader," she said slowly, an old, half-forgotten name surfacing from the depths of childhood memory, fragments of conversations she'd overheard, as Elena discussed the danger with other pack elders long ago. "Was his name Adrian Voss?" Something flickered across the king's expression, sharp and immediate. "You know that name?" "I remember hearing it," Lyra said, her voice unsteady. "When I was very young, Elena and the others used to speak of him in whispers, like saying his name too loudly might draw his attention." "Adrian Voss has led the Purifiers for decades," the king confirmed grimly. "He's responsible for the deaths of nearly every remaining member of the sacred bloodlines over the past generation, your mother among them, if the timing and circumstances you've described align with what I know of his methods." The confirmation settled over Lyra like a physical weight, old grief and fresh fear tangling together in a way that made it hard to breathe properly. If he's the one asking questions in the Northern Territories, if he's heard about the gathering, about what happened here, then he already knows you exist, the king finished grimly. And knowing Voss's history, he won't rest until he's confirmed it personally. Elena's expression had grown increasingly pale throughout the conversation, old fears clearly resurfacing alongside Lyra's own. We need to reinforce the territory's defenses immediately, she said. If Voss and his followers are moving this direction, we cannot afford to be caught unprepared. Agreed. The king's attention returned to the map, his finger tracing the northern border with grim precision. I'll recall additional guards from neighboring territories. We'll increase patrols along every approach to this pack house, and I want watch posts established at these 3 points, covering the most likely routes an approaching group might take. The next several days passed in a haze of careful preparation, the entire territory transformed by an undercurrent of tension that reminded Lyra painfully of the fear she had lived with for 5 long years, though this time, at least, she wasn't facing it entirely alone. The king's guards worked alongside pack members to reinforce boundaries and establish watch rotations, and Lyra found herself, despite the mounting danger, grateful for the sense of shared purpose that had replaced her previous isolation. She spent increasing amounts of time in the king's company during those tense days, drawn together as much by necessity as by the growing, cautious trust that had begun developing between them since the night of her exposure. He explained, in greater detail, the history of the Purifiers, their decades-long campaign against the sacred bloodlines, the particular cruelty Adrian Voss had inflicted on those unfortunate enough to cross his path. Why does he hate the bloodline so much? Lyra asked one evening, as they reviewed reports together in the quiet privacy of the meeting hall. What could my mother, what could I, have possibly done to deserve this kind of hatred? Fear, mostly, the king said grimly. The old stories claim the sacred bloodlines carry a kind of power that could, in the wrong circumstances, challenge even the authority of an alpha king. Voss has spent his life believing that power represents an existential threat to the established order, one that must be eliminated entirely, rather than risked. That's absurd, Lyra said, frustration bleeding into her voice. I've spent my entire life hiding, trying to be as unremarkable as possible. I've never wanted power over anyone. I know that, he said gently, but fear rarely concerns itself with truth, Lyra. Voss has built his entire identity around eliminating a threat that, as far as I can determine, has never actually manifested the way he claims to fear. That doesn't make him any less dangerous, unfortunately. If anything, it makes him more so, since there's no reasoning with a conviction that's strong. The conversation left Lyra feeling unsettled long after it ended, old fears resurfacing alongside a new, sharper anger at the senseless cruelty that had shaped so much of her life without her ever having any say in the matter. She thought of her mother again, of the fierce, protective love that had cost her life defending a daughter who had done nothing wrong beyond existing, and something hardened within her that hadn't been there before. She was tired of running. She was tired of hiding. And whatever came next, whatever confrontation Adrian Voss and his Purifiers might be planning, she found herself determined, for the first time in her life, to face it rather than flee. It was 3 days later, as the tension across the territory had begun to stretch toward something close to breaking, that the watch posts along the northern border finally reported movement. A guard arrived at the meeting hall breathless and urgent, delivering news that sent the entire territory into immediate controlled motion. A group has been spotted approaching from the north, he reported. Perhaps 24 wolves, moving with purpose. They'll reach the outer boundary within the hour. The king rose immediately, his expression shifting into the sharp, commanding authority Lyra remembered from their earliest encounters. Though now, standing beside him rather than facing his suspicion, she found herself grateful rather than fearful of that same unwavering resolve. Sound the alarm, he ordered. All guards to their positions. I want every approach to this territory covered before they arrive. The pack house grounds erupted into swift, organized motion, guards and pack members alike moving into prepared defensive positions with an efficiency that spoke of days of careful preparation. Lyra felt her heart pounding, not with the familiar panic of hiding, but with something new, something closer to determination. What do you need me to do? She asked, turning to the king, as guards moved past them in every direction. He studied her for a moment, something complicated flickering across his expression. Stay close to Elena. in the most protected position we can arrange. This confrontation is dangerous, Lyra, and Voss's entire purpose in coming here is to eliminate exactly what you represent. I'm not going to hide, she said, surprising herself with the firmness of her own voice. I've spent 5 years hiding, and it never actually protected me from any of this. I want to face him. Something shifted in the king's expression, a complicated mixture of concern and, unless she was imagining it, genuine respect. Then you'll face him beside me, he said finally, not alone, and not without protection. Whatever happens tonight, we face it together. The words settled something within her, a fragile but genuine sense of partnership that felt entirely different from the isolated fear she had carried for so long. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across a territory braced for confrontation, Lyra found herself standing beside the Alpha King, watching the northern tree line with a steady resolve that would have seemed impossible only a few short weeks before. Whatever Adrian Voss and his purifiers intended when they arrived, she would not face it as the frightened, hidden girl who had spent 5 years running from her own nature. She would face it as exactly what she was, standing in the open, refusing any longer to be defined by fear. The purifiers emerged from the tree line just as the last light faded from the sky, their approach every bit as disciplined and purposeful as the reports had suggested. At their head walked a tall, gaunt man, whose presence carried an unmistakable, chilling authority, and Lyra knew, with a certainty that settled cold in her chest, that she was looking at Adrian Voss for the first time. He stopped a short distance from the assembled defenders, his sharp eyes sweeping across the gathered wolves before settling, with unerring precision, directly on Lyra. Something like satisfaction crossed his gaunt features, the look of a man finally confirming a suspicion he had carried for a very long time. So the rumors were true after all, he said, his voice carrying easily across the tense silence of the clearing. The White Wolf survives. You have no business here, Voss. The king's voice rang out with absolute authority, positioning himself protectively at Lyra's side. This territory falls under my direct authority. Whatever quarrel you carry against the old bloodlines, you will not pursue it here. With respect, my king, Voss said, though nothing in his tone carried genuine respect at all. The bloodline in question represents a danger this region cannot afford to ignore. I've spent my life ensuring that danger never has the opportunity to manifest. I don't intend to stop now. I've done nothing to threaten anyone, Lyra said, stepping forward, despite the king's protective stance, refusing to let fear silence her the way it had for 5 long years. You killed my mother for existing. Are you here to do the same to me? Something flickered across Voss's expression, brief and unreadable, before settling back into cold determination. Your mother's death was a necessary precaution. Yours would be no different, if it comes to that. But I would prefer, if possible, to resolve this matter without unnecessary conflict.
There's nothing to resolve,
the king said sharply.
This wolf poses no threat to anyone. Your fear is rooted in old superstition, not present reality.
Perhaps that's true, Voss acknowledged, though his tone carried no genuine flexibility. Or perhaps the danger simply hasn't manifested yet. I've spent decades studying the old prophecies, my king. I know what they claim about a white wolf standing beside an alpha king, uniting fractured territories under a single unprecedented authority. Tell me you haven't considered the possibility that such power, concentrated in 2 individuals, might represent exactly the kind of threat my organization exists to prevent. The king's jaw tightened, though his voice remained steady. Unity is not a threat, Voss. It's the very thing this region has needed for generations, torn apart as it's been by exactly the kind of fear and suspicion your organization has spent decades cultivating. The standoff stretched taut between them, tension crackling through the clearing like static before a storm, every gathered wolf on both sides poised for whatever might come next. Lyra felt her heart pounding, but beneath the fear, something steadier had taken root. The same hardened resolve that had carried her through the confrontation of standing openly before her own pack days before. I won't run from you, she said, addressing Voss directly, her voice carrying more strength than she had known she possessed. I won't hide, and I won't apologize for existing. My mother died, trying to protect that same refusal, and I intend to honor what she sacrificed, rather than let her death be for nothing. Voss studied her for a long moment, something calculating moving behind his cold eyes. Brave words, he said finally, from someone who spent 5 years in hiding, before circumstance forced her hand. Perhaps, Lyra acknowledged, refusing to let the accusation shame her. But I'm not hiding now. And I won't be, going forward, regardless of what you or your organization believe about what I represent. The tension in the clearing seemed to hang for an endless moment, and Lyra watched Voss's expression carefully, searching for any sign of the violence she had feared might be inevitable. But something in her steady refusal to be intimidated, combined with the king's unwavering authority and the obvious, organized readiness of the defenders arrayed around them, seemed to shift the calculation Voss had clearly been making since his arrival. This territory is well defended, Voss said finally, his gaze sweeping across the assembled guards with grudging assessment, and the political cost of an open conflict with the Alpha King himself would be considerable, regardless of how this confrontation might ultimately resolve. He looked back at Lyra, his expression unreadable. This isn't finished, but I won't pursue further conflict tonight. If you or your organization threaten this territory again, the king said, his voice carrying an authority that left no room for misinterpretation, you will find the response considerably less restrained than tonight's welcome. Consider this your only warning, Voss. Voss held the king's gaze for a long, tense moment, before finally inclining his head, a gesture that fell somewhere between acknowledgement and grudging respect. Without another word, he turned and retreated back toward the tree line, his followers falling into disciplined formation behind him, the entire group disappearing into the darkness as swiftly and purposefully as they had arrived. The clearing remained tense for several long minutes after they'd gone, guards maintaining careful watch in case the retreat proved to be a temporary tactic rather than genuine withdrawal. But as the minutes stretched on without further incident, the tension gradually began to ease, replaced by a cautious, disbelieving relief that rippled through the assembled defenders. Lyra felt her knees weaken slightly as the adrenaline of the confrontation began to fade, and the king's hand found her arm immediately, steadying her, with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the commanding authority he'd carried moments before. You did well tonight, he said quietly, meant only for her. Better than well. You faced him without flinching. I was terrified, she admitted, her voice unsteady with the aftermath of adrenaline. I don't think I've ever been more afraid in my entire life. Fear and courage aren't opposites, Lyra, he said gently. Courage is choosing to stand firm despite the fear, not the absence of it. You did that tonight, in front of the very man who killed your mother. That took a strength most wolves never have to test in their entire lives. The words settled something within her, a fragile but genuine pride she hadn't expected to feel amid the lingering fear of the confrontation. She thought of her mother, of the fierce courage that had cost her life so many years before, and felt, for the first time, that perhaps she had finally honored that sacrifice, rather than merely surviving in its shadow. The days that followed brought a slow, gradual settling of the territory back into something resembling normalcy, though nothing about Lyra's life would ever fully return to what it had been before the king's arrival. She no longer hid her true nature, walking openly among pack members who had, in the wake of the confrontation with Voss, largely shifted their wariness into something closer to respect. Even Victor, though never quite warm toward her, had grown noticeably quieter in his suspicions, apparently humbled by watching her stand firm against a danger he had never anticipated she might actually face head-on. The bond between Lyra and the king, forged through weeks of suspicion and danger and gradual, hard-won trust, continued to deepen in the weeks that followed. He remained in the territory longer than his original visit had ever intended, citing ongoing concerns about the purifiers as justification, though Lyra suspected, and eventually confirmed through quiet conversation, that his continued presence had as much to do with reluctance to leave her side as any genuine political necessity. It was nearly a month after the confrontation, on an evening when the moon hung full and bright above the territory once more, that he finally spoke the words that would reshape her future entirely. I've spent my entire reign believing the old prophecies were little more than comforting stories, he told her, as they stood together near the edge of the clearing where her secret had first been revealed. But watching you these past weeks, watching the courage and grace with which you've faced everything thrown at you, I've come to believe the old stories might have understood something true after all. What are you saying? Lyra asked, though something in her chest had already begun to guess at his meaning. I'm saying that I want you beside me, he said. His usual careful authority softened into something far more vulnerable than she had ever seen from him before. Not because of any prophecy, though I won't pretend that history doesn't matter to me, but because I've come to care for you, Lyra Ashworth, more deeply than I expected to care for anyone again. I want to claim you as my mate, publicly, before every pack under my authority, if you'll have me. The offer settled over her with a weight that felt, impossibly, more freeing than frightening. 5 years of hiding had taught her to fear exposure above all else, to view every revealed truth as a step closer to danger. But standing here now, in the same clearing where her deepest secret had finally come to light, she understood that this particular truth, offered freely and without condition, represented something entirely different. Yes, she said, the word carrying a certainty she hadn't expected to feel so completely. I'll stand beside you, Cale, not because of any prophecy, but because I choose to. The ceremony that followed, held beneath the same full moon that had once threatened to expose her deepest secret, transformed instead into a celebration unlike anything the territory had witnessed in generations. Pack members who had once eyed her with suspicion now gathered to witness her formal claiming, and Lyra stood at the center of it all, no longer hidden, no longer afraid, her white fur catching moonlight as she stood proudly beside the wolf who had become, against every expectation, her chosen partner. She thought of her mother often in the days that followed, of the fierce, protective love that had cost so much and given her, ultimately, the strength to survive long enough to reach this unexpected happiness. She was no longer the frightened girl hiding in the shadows of a stolen childhood, desperate to disappear before anyone could see the truth of what she was. She was Lyra Ashworth, the white wolf of old prophecy, standing openly beside the Alpha King, and for the first time in her entire life, she felt no need to hide at all.